for stopping by Brian for Liberty once again. I do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come by and spend a little time with me. I am going to be talking about Black Lives Matter today, and I know that this is a sensitive topic right now, and I also know that I'm going to hear this isn't the time to have this conversation, but in my opinion, this is the exact time to have this conversation. It's really the only time to have this conversation because the American public has the attention span of a 2-year-old on a sugar high, and unfortunately, as tragic as this whole situation has been, we will move on as a nation within a month or two and look back at this as something that happened once. Let me start by saying this. I've been talking about how problematic the Black Lives Matter movement is for a while. And that always gets met with a certain amount of resistance. I've been called an Uncle Tom for that statement, for actually suggesting that there are ways that this movement could expand and actually have a larger coalition and maybe actually work towards enacting real political change. And I get called an Uncle Tom for that. So that's problematic in and of itself. It's obviously a very intolerant, very closed-minded group of individuals running this organization or representing this organization. And as a result, they are probably not going to grow or progress. They're going to probably remain largely ineffective. Point to me some legislation, one piece in all 50 states or at the federal level that's been brought before a legislature or in response to rioting or protests or pressure from the Black Lives Movement people. There isn't any. I've seen comments where they are comparing this movement to the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King. The greatest domestic change in policy since the Civil War it was enacted as a result of that movement, and people are comparing this movement to that. This is a movement that shows up once every couple of years. I'm going to get into all of that. I also want to say that the Black community in this country has suffered. They have been oppressed. And as a result of that suffering and as a result of that oppression, they are particularly sensitive to certain actions by the government. They are particularly sensitive to government intervention in economics. They're particularly sensitive to those things. That's always the case with vulnerable members of your community. That's always how it's going to be. That is not the same as systemic racism. That is not the same as a system of systemic and state-sanctioned violence against the Black community, which is what Black Lives is saying is going on out there. I actually did a video a while back that talked specifically about the Black community's vulnerabilities to the welfare state, to the war on drugs, and I stand by that today. I do think that there's a certain level of sensitivity here that needs to be addressed, a certain level of impact upon the Black community that we need to talk about. And we need to put together large coalitions of people of all races and be able to position ourselves to enact the kind of positive action and systemic political changes necessary to get the Black community on even footing with the rest of the country. That's a thing that does need to happen. But this is not the way. And I'm going to share with you today the 3 reasons I think Black Lives Matter is a largely ineffective group. I'm going to go over all 3 right now. And at the end of this video, I am going to highlight a group that gets much less attention, is actually doing the work Black Lives Matter is avoiding. They're doing it on the ground in their own communities. So stick around to the end of the video so you can learn a little bit about this group, where they are, and how you might be able to support them if you really want to start making impact on the ground where Black lives are actually being lost. But when we get into the 3 reasons that I believe that Black Lives Matter is relatively problematic and ineffective, the first thing, and this is going to be very controversial, the first thing is Black Lives was formed to fight a problem that doesn't exist. So why not start with the most controversial thought process of all here? This is the single most important message that has to get out. What is going on is disgusting and perverse. Their messaging is that they are formed to fight the systematic and state-sanctioned violence against Black people. That doesn't exist. That's not a thing. They're fighting something that doesn't exist. They're fighting an invisible enemy. How do I know I'm right? And I am right. How do I know that I'm right? You could do a statistical deep dive, and you can look at criminality, and you can look at the amount of crime committed by that community versus this, and police interactions and all those different things. You could do that, and 100 people have done it. And those numbers are shoved in our faces all the time as a result of these kinds of protests. And the idea that there's a systemic issue against the Black community here, we go back to those numbers and say, well, yeah, but look, it doesn't make sense. So I'm not going to get in. I'm not going to break all those numbers down. There's 100 different places you can go and find that information. I could do a deep dive on the legal side of it. And let's take a look at the laws. Is the law racially ambiguous? Is the law saying things that point to a particular race? Are there laws that specifically state that black people are to be treated differently in the criminal justice system? Are there laws specifically stating that are the laws specifically stating that black people are supposed to be treated differently in our society? No, there's not. So the law in and of itself isn't racist. The numbers statistically don't back it up. But how do I know I'm right? I'll tell you how. The real way to tell is that in the 6 years since the founding of Black Lives Matter, they've had so few incidents that fit the specific criteria they created for their own movement that they can be counted on my fingers. How many large-scale protests has Black Lives Matter been involved in over the last 6 years? They were essentially unofficially started in 2013 and officially founded in 2014. That's 6 years since their official founding. How many major protests have they been involved in? Yeah, I can count them on my fingers. The fact that the incidents and the specific things that they're targeting happen so rarely that it's really once every 2 years that you see a wide-ranging, broad protest like this, tells me that what they're fighting is something that's, as tragic as it is statistically insignificant. And it's very important because we live in a state of constant surveillance. And this is especially true of law enforcement. We know you have to imagine that every time a cop comes into contact with a black person, that they are being filmed, not only by the person that may be with that black person, by the people who may be on the street around the officer and filming this interaction, waiting for something to happen, to the very justifiable and rightfully required body cams that the police themselves are wearing. So the question is with all of this surveillance, why are we not seeing more of these incidents? Why are we not seeing protests every month, every week? And this is an important thing to keep in mind because we have to remember the numbers. So here's a number to keep in mind: 3,500,000. What is that number? That is the number of times a law enforcement officer has had to initiate contact with a black person. That is the number of contacts between law enforcement officers and black people that was initiated by the police. That doesn't include times that black people actually called the police over, but actual interactions created by the police force. 3,500,000. Just for perspective, there were about 18 million police-initiated interactions between officer and white people. These numbers are from 2015. So we're talking about literally millions of interactions between cops and blacks in a single year. How many of those incidents ended up in something worth protesting? If you're going to say that there is a systemic and state-sanctioned policy of violence against blacks, out of literally millions of events, there should be hundreds of thousands of examples of activity that would support a protest. We should be inundated with this all the time. There should be incidents day after day after day. Like I said, 10%, if 10% of these interactions were protestable, ended in a protestable offense, you'd be talking about 300,000+. If you count the times blacks have called police to their communities, you'd be talking about 600,000, over 500,000, just if 10% of those ended in a protestable offense. Even if 10% of them ended and you only captured half of that in our modern surveillance state, I think that would be light. You'd still be looking at over 300,000 incidents on video every year showing police brutality. You don't have that. You can't tell me that there is systemic and state-sanctioned violence as a policy against black people in this country and not be able to point to it and not be able to see it. We live in a surveillance state. But here's the worst part. When I talk about this being pervasive and disgusting, the distrust and animosity this type of narrative creates prevents law-abiding black families in these dangerous neighborhoods from understanding that police are their allies. This is incredibly important, okay? I'm going to say it again. The distrust and animosity this type of narrative creates prevents law-abiding black families in these neighborhoods from understanding that the police are their allies. Advertising works, and the reason that you know that is because they spend billions and billions of dollars on it every year. A narrative pushed by mainstream media, black organizations like Black Lives Matter, constantly being pushed into the face of black people, telling them, teaching them, training them that the police are their enemies, make them unable to utilize law enforcement to protect their own neighborhoods. Black people living in poor neighborhoods they have a wall thrown up between them and their protectors under the guise of caring about saving black lives. We're losing black lives because Black Lives Matter and the black narrative of black leadership in this country is telling black people you can't trust the police. These people living in these communities, these law-abiding black citizens of our country, are afraid to call their own police. They know who the criminals are in their neighborhoods. They know where the drug dens are. They know who the violent people are. And they can't work with the police department to get these people off the streets. We're losing black lives because of that wall that's being built between law-abiding black citizens and the police department. And that is sad. That's a tragedy. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, by and large, Black Lives Matter doesn't care about black lives. And I'm not talking about the individuals within the movement. I'm not talking about the people who are out there protesting. I know some of these people. I know some of the people who are incredibly passionate about Black Lives Matter, about the movement itself. But the movement is so focused on singular action that has virtually no chance of actually saving black lives. Okay, if the goal was to police the police department, if the goal was to get bad cops off the force and expose police brutality wherever it appeared, then it might have a small chance of actually saving some black lives, because we'd be looking for and watching the police constantly, and we'd be pushing them off the force. And again, it goes back to being able to have a larger coalition of people, because you're talking about all police brutality. Nobody supports police brutality. So if you start talking about all police brutality and we start really policing the police, and you're creating this massive citizen organization that's job is to expose police brutality, then you are going to be able to get bad cops off the street. And in that case, you may be able to save some black lives. But let's go back to the millions of interactions year after year after year. And still, you have to understand that when you're talking about police brutality, and more importantly, the unjustified death of someone at the hands of the police, you're still looking at what essentially comes down to a needle in a haystack in terms of all the combined police interactions, which total in 2015 were close to 28, or maybe just a little over 28 million interactions between police and citizens. And think about that number for a minute: 28 million interactions between police and citizens. And that's all races throughout the entire year. You're looking for unjustified homicides at the hands of the police amongst 28 million interactions. Find them. You're looking for a needle in a haystack. And that speaks more to the falsehood that there is a systemic, state-sponsored, state-sanctioned policy of violence against the black community. So this is just another example of why they are problematic. And then you can't just show up every couple of years and hold up. I'm sorry to say, you can't show up every couple of years and hold up relatively problematic individuals as heroes and martyrs and expect the world to change. And that's what this organization does. They come out every couple of years when the right set of events exists for them to take action. They hold up incredibly problematic people as martyrs, as heroes, which is divisive in and of itself. And then they disappear. And you don't hear about them any other time. You don't hear them marching for black lives when thousands of black men are murdered at the hands of other black men. But then, do Black Lives Matter? Even in this scenario, even in what's going on right now, several black people have been killed in the riots. When are their marches going to be? When is there going to be a march for David Dorn? When are the T-shirts with his face going to be on? When will we see those? We won't, because those things aren't politically expedient. And so their primary concern is political expediency. And I think that's really sad, because I think there's a lot of people involved in the movement who support the movement, who are very passionate and would love to see actual change take place. And they're being misled by this organization. And lastly, and this is incredibly important, and I've kind of talked around it a little bit, but they're asking for abstract, not concrete changes. That's probably for a couple of reasons. First, abstracts are super easy to create, and they're very emotionally charged. We want justice. What does that mean? Explain to me what justice means. Let's say we want justice for George Floyd. Okay, the officer who killed him is under arrest and charged with murder, and so are his accomplices are also under arrest with their charges pending. Is that not justice for George Floyd? Well, you tell me beyond that, what does justice for George Floyd mean? What does justice in general mean? What's the specific thing that you're asking for here? Justice is an abstract. We want equality. What does that mean? Do you want equality of opportunity? Do you want equality of outcome? Do you want... What specifically, from an equality perspective, do you want? We've already talked about the fact that the laws are written in a racially ambiguous fashion. So we have equality under the law. So what equality are you speaking of? You tell me what that means. What does that look like? What specific changes are you asking for? What legislation do you need that should be proposed to bring about this equality or this justice? And then when we talk about that and the ineffectiveness, stop comparing that. I've run into a lot of people who are comparing this to the civil rights movement. It's not. This is the difference. This is where the ineffectiveness comes from. This is the civil rights movement had concrete requests. We're going to end Jim Crow era laws regarding segregation. We're going to make discrimination based on race, gender, and ethnicity illegal. We're creating a truly even playing field. That was the goal of the civil rights movement. They had a goal. The legislation got proposed and it got passed. It was the largest, most successful domestic change in policy ever in the modern era. So to compare Black Lives Matter to the civil rights movement, we have a long way to go before you are in that same conversation. The bottom line is you can't have a political movement that has no specific direction or demands and expect any real change to come from it. So my takedown here is not to say that there aren't problems in the system. It's not to say Black Lives Matter isn't even well-intentioned. It's simply to say it is misguided and unfocused. In the end, the change they are looking for will not come because they don't know what to demand or how to demand it. I don't want to bring attention. In the end, the change they're looking for is not going to come because they don't know what to demand and they don't know how to demand it. So like I said at the beginning, I do want to bring attention to a group called MASK. This stands for Mothers Against Senseless Killing. This is a group founded in Chicago. They're dedicated to ending gun and gang violence. And they're really doing the work on the ground in their own neighborhoods. They are literally putting their lives at risk, putting themselves in harm's way by doing what they're doing. And I'm going to put a link to their Facebook page in my video description. So please check them out and support them if you can. Also, I am still planning on getting the video on Social Security out. I'm hoping to have it up on Sunday. This really kind of took my attention. I think it's kind of taken the attention of the nation. I'm sure you guys can understand that I'm going to push the Social Security one back a little bit. But I will edit it and get it up on Sunday. So make sure you're subscribed and you have your notifications turned on if you're interested in why the Social Security program needs to be completely dismantled. I really appreciate you guys checking in. Thanks. And as always, we will see you next time.